Hello and welcome to the ISE webinar. My name is Marina and I will be facilitating today's webinar. Shortly, I will hand over to Tristram Hooley, who will be presenting the results of our Pulse survey and who will also be exploring whether the plan for jobs will really make a difference to young workers and student employers. If this is your first time joining our webinar, you are muted. However, you have an opportunity to ask questions. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the question box, which should be on your right-hand side in the software panel. And I will feed them through to Tristram at the end of the presentation. This webinar is recorded, so the recorded version should be uploaded by the end of the day or tomorrow the latest. So you will have an opportunity to rewatch and share this with your colleagues and peers. That's it for me. Over to you, Tristram.
Great. Okay, thank you. I'm going to talk today about the Chancellor's Plan for Jobs, which is the big scheme that he's got, or the government has got, to try and get us all back to work and get the economy on its feet again. So I'm going to try and talk through that, talk through some of the key elements of that, and then I'm going to focus in on some of the elements that are specifically relevant to student employers. So that's really what we're going to do. As Marina says, just send any questions. We'll get to them at the end. Shouldn't take too long today, I think. So I did a little survey, a pulse survey, got 69 responses drawn from a range of our normal sectors. It's not the most brilliant response we've ever had to a survey. And I think sometimes that can tell you something. I think it's probable that employers are a little bit underwhelmed with the plan for jobs and didn't feel it was a kind of top priority for them to talk about. But it is useful to have some insights. I mean, I've also been spending quite a lot of time in meetings with employers, talking to them about some of these things. But having a few, a bit more quantitative data can sometimes be useful in giving us some insights into where employers are at with this. So I'm going to I'm going to present back some of the data as we go along, but I'm also going to be sort of weaving it into a bit more policy analysis kind of approach to this webinar. So basically, I'm going to try and look at four things. Why do we need a plan? What is the plan for jobs? The implications for students and employers in particular, and then what needs to happen next. So that's what we're going to do. So why do we need a plan? Well, if we just look at recent news, we can see that there are some pretty big problems. So a report came out last week from the EY Foundation, which said that a full economic recovery could take until 2024. So there's a very substantial set of economic problems caused by the lockdown and by the pandemic and by the shifts to our economy that have resulted from COVID-19. And so obviously people are worried about that. If we then look at what the implications for the labour market are, we can see that we're seeing a very competitive labour market. So you've probably seen some stories like this over the last few weeks. So this is one, almost 1,000 people applied for a receptionist job in Manchester. And this kind of thing where you're getting huge numbers of people applying for fairly entry-level jobs is obviously quite worrying, because it tells you that there are a lot of people in the economy who are very nervous about their position and are looking to move on and try and find something more solid. We've got lots of people on furlough still, but the furlough scheme is coming to an end. And so we're seeing some real anxiety in the economy and in the labour market about what it's going to look like. If we break that down with a bit more quantitative data, we've got some job adverts. This is analysis that is done by the Office for National Statistics. And what they've done, so the dark blue line on these charts, so it's broken down by sector. Dark blue line is this year, the light blue line is last year. No, sorry, other way around. Light blue line is this year, dark blue line is last year. And what you can see there, if we look at the way that this has happened, has progressed, is these are the number of job adverts that have been made. So if we look across all industries, which is our first chart here, we can see that from March, when the lockdown really started, the number of job adverts has really dramatically fallen, and it's about half of what it was last year. So there's a really big shift, and it's not really recovered. I mean, the decline has stopped, but the level of job adverts has not really recovered. So there's a lot less people advertising vacancies. But as we can see from the next 4 charts, that varies quite a bit by sector. So in the healthcare sector, actually, if anything, there have probably been more job adverts this year than there were last year. Education, yes, there have been a bit less, but not dramatically so. But then we look at areas like wholesale and retail, catering, hospitality, we see very dramatic drops. So the labour market is very weak at the moment. There aren't very many people advertising, there aren't many firms advertising jobs. There are lots and lots of people who are interested in jobs, and that really sets the stage for why there's a concern about the economy and why the government felt it was necessary to create a plan for jobs. Now, if we look at the data, this is from our little Pulse survey that we've just done. We asked people, okay, in comparison with 2018, 2019, how's your recruitment looking? And you know, the biggest chunk of people, both when describing this year and when describing next year, and these are, remember, ISE employers, so big employers, big student employers. The biggest chunk of them are saying, it's about the same, we've been about the same. And actually, people are a little bit more confident about next year than they were about this year. There's been a lot of disruption this year, that's not surprising. But if we then add up the number of people who are saying actually either a lot less, somewhat less, or slightly less, they're going to recruit next year, and compare it to the number who are saying slightly more, somewhat more, a lot more, what we can see is that there's an awful lot more employers who are going to reduce their recruitment next year as opposed to increase it. And we'd normally expect to see something of a balance in that. In fact, in recent years, we've seen a lot of employers increasing slightly their recruitment every year in terms of graduates and so on. So what we're seeing is, even in our part of the market, it's not as extreme as some of those figures that I was just showing you from the retail and hospitality sectors. But even in our part of the market, even in the student and the graduate recruitment parts of the market, we're seeing a depressed labour market and people recruiting lower numbers than they otherwise probably would have done. So this is obviously worrying to all of us. It's worrying to us who, you know, if we were in work, everybody's worried obviously about what the issues are in terms of losing their jobs. But it's particularly worrying for young people who have not entered the labour market yet. It's very concerning. If you're not in the labour market yet, there's a big question about, will you be able to get in? Will you be able to find a job? Or are we likely to see the number of young unemployed people going up very substantially? So it's not just me worrying about this, it's not just graduates or young people worrying about this, it's also the government worrying about this. And so at the weekend we saw this story, which is how the government, so in this case Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, are meeting to discuss how to avoid a new lockdown. And there's various ideas they're floating, which I think we probably shouldn't spend too much time looking at the details of, because they are quite speculative at the moment. The point is that people are quite worried about the economic situation, and the government's particularly worried in the context that the lockdown may not be over, the pandemic certainly isn't over, and so we're going to be continuing into a situation where things are still very disrupted next year. So that then takes us on to what is the plan for jobs. So, well, the plan for jobs is a new government policy. You can read about it on the government website. All of the documents are there. There's actually quite a lot of detail still to come out. It was all pretty high level. So we'll probably be hearing a bit more about it, but I think we probably know enough to feel that we can make a plan for how things are going to go. So I'm going to take you through some of the basic things. So if we read what the government were trying to do, These are the four main aims. So they're trying to encourage firms to keep on furloughed workers, not to make them redundant, to support jobs, and that's about helping people to find work and getting skills they need, to protect jobs particularly in sectors that are hard hit, and to create new jobs through a range of different stimulus packages. So that's things like changes to stamp duty in the property market to try and get the property market going, some investment in green infrastructure, broader infrastructure investments, and so on. So this is what they were aiming to do, was basically to address economic problems, particularly through the lens of jobs. So it's very much a labour market lens. People are worried about, will there be enough work for people? And so now there's been, I'm not going to go into all the detailed criticisms of the plan for jobs. You know, one of the things you may have heard is that some of these initiatives that were announced in the plan for jobs were actually already announced, so they didn't constitute new money. But broadly, if we kind of give the government the benefit of the doubt, what they were trying to do was to put money into the economy in various different places to try and stimulate the economy in ways that would actually provide work for people. So I think probably most of us would think that was a good idea. So then let's dive in and look a bit more at what they did in detail. So this is a table from the plan for jobs actual document, and I think it's quite useful because it tells you how much money they're planning to spend on different things, which gives you a bit of an idea about how important different things are in terms of what the government thinks it's worth putting money in. So ultimately, there's a plan to spend 30 billion here, and as we've probably become quite familiar, recent government announcements have started to throw around a lot more money than they used to. And so we now deal in billions quite often. So how are you going to spend those billions? Well, the first chunk of it, 9.5 billion there, is going to be spent on the job retention bonus. So that's paying firms £1,000 to take back workers who they've put onto furlough. So it's an incentive to bring more people back from furlough. And if firms bring back as many as the government think they will, then that could cost up to 9.4 million. So then let's look at this supporting jobs. Well, the first thing they're doing in the supporting jobs is what they're calling the Kickstart scheme. I'm going to talk about that a bit more in detail in a second. Essentially, that's investment in young workers, paying the wages of young workers, and they might spend 2.1 billion. Right, now, it's worth noting that both of those things that I've just talked about, the 9.4 billion and the 2.1 billion, are entirely dependent on employers' decisions. So that's a guess. That's Rishi Sunak putting his finger in the air and making a guess about how much these things are likely to cost. And you know, whether that will be the case depends on whether employers decide ultimately to retain as many staff as the government would like them to, and also to bring on as many Kickstart young people as the government would like them to. And we'll see, we'll discuss whether that's likely or not in a second. The next 1.6 billion is a bit on boosting work search, so that's investment in job centres, a little bit in the National Careers Service, but also bonuses that are being paid to employers for traineeships and apprenticeships, which I'll come to later. We then see some money to reduce VAT for hospitality, accommodation and attraction, so areas of the economy that the government feels they're quite worried about, so they're reducing VAT for that. And then the much fated Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which hopefully everybody is going and making good use of to try and stimulate the restaurant industry. Now, obviously, the problems with all of those things is that people did not stop using going to pubs, going to restaurants, going to hotels, going to attractions because they became too expensive. People stopped going because of the disease. And so one of the areas that the government was criticised here was that this is not really focusing on the problem. You're reducing the costs of these things in such a way that is not actually likely to increase demand that much until you've sorted out the issues with the illnesses. And then we see some job creation ideas. So putting some money into infrastructure, quite a bit there, 5.6. Public sector and social housing, decarbonation. This is the kind of Green New Deal ideas that that the government have kind of adopted, which many of the other political parties were talking about before the election, and now have come into Conservative Party thinking as well. So you've also got the Green Homes grant there, and then the cut to stamp duty, which I've already mentioned. So that's how the 30 billion is dealt with. If we then think about what are the implications for student employers, there's basically four. So the first is the job retention bonus. This is £1,000 payment for employers for each member of furloughed staff who remains continuously employed until the end of January. So if you bring people back from furlough and you keep them on till January, then your firm gets £1,000. Now, for student employers, this might be an issue because some firms might decide to reduce recruitment in favour of the retention of existing staff. And when I asked ISE members, only 12% of them actually thought that £1,000 would make a difference. So this is one of the schemes. At the moment, the ISE members are not looking like this is something that they think is particularly important. Next one I've mentioned is Kickstart. So this is the idea that you can take on a young person, somebody who's been unemployed for 6 months, employ them for 6 months, and the government will pay all of the costs up to 25 hours a week. Now, this was not very popular with when we did our survey. Only 8% of members said they would employ a Kickstarter, but most people weren't sure. So there's still a sense, and I've talked to quite a lot of employers, there's still a sense that people are thinking about these things, particularly employers that have got some sort of social conscience, or employers where they think actually we could bring a young person in. We've got a lot of very low level, entry level jobs. We could bring someone in, get them doing some work, and essentially the government will pay for that. Maybe that will be helpful. But there are obviously also lots of secondary costs from employing people. You've got to manage them. You've got to deal with some kind of approach to actually handling the person in your organization. It's not going to be free, even if the government pays the salary costs. The next thing that the government's doing that might be relevant for student employers, and that if you're responsible for recruitment, you might be asked about, is traineeships. Now, traineeships are a pre-existing framework for providing jobs with training. They're lighter, often lower level than apprenticeships. They may not require payment in all cases for the individual, but the plan for job, the idea is it's supposed to be an entry level job with training. The plan for jobs will pay employers £1,000 for every trainee they take on. Generally, people are not very sure that they're going to take on trainees due to the scheme, but only 7% said they would do it, 47% said they weren't sure. I've not encountered traineeships being a particularly big issue in the ISE membership. Traineeships haven't been hugely successful for various reasons. So this is an attempt to kind of get them going again. At the moment, it doesn't look like this is going to be a big issue. And then finally, the fourth issue that's important, I think, in the plan for jobs for student employers is the issue of apprenticeships. There's a £2,000 incentive for every new young apprentice that you take on, not for pre-existing employees. And 20% of ISE members said, yes, actually, we think we will take on new apprentices. 38% aren't sure. So there's a bit more interest in that as an idea. And that's partly because the ISE membership is quite invested in apprenticeships already. So perhaps slightly increasing your numbers of apprentices, or perhaps maintaining your numbers if you otherwise would have cut them, is something that people might be considering. So what needs to happen next? So that hopefully has set out the kind of key implications. Well, will it make a difference? Well, ISE members generally don't believe that it will change how their firm will operate, and only about a quarter of them think it will make a substantial impact on the UK economy. Obviously, nobody knows. The jury is still very much out. I think there's lots in the plan for jobs that we would certainly hope works, but will it be effective? So I mean, my sense is that most of our membership are thinking, well, probably not. It's probably not going to change how we operate, and so therefore we're not really convinced it's going to have a substantial impact on the UK economy. Broadly, my perspective, for what it's worth, is that there's a lot to like in the plan for jobs, but it's probably not big enough or bold enough. Some of these incentives that we've been talking about, the £1,000 for a traineeship, or for keeping a member of staff on, £2,000 for a apprentice, even paying the whole salaries of an unemployed young person. These ask quite a lot of firms, and they don't give quite enough back, I think. So I think it's probably not big enough. I hope I'm wrong. I hope it does drive employment very positively, but my sense is at the moment is it probably isn't big enough to make the differences that we hope. So I'll just remind you of the ISE's plan for the reconstruction of the student labour market, which we released a few weeks before the plan for jobs came out, and it's an area where we're still campaigning. And in that we said, well, actually, broadly, these are the kinds of things that the government are thinking about and were evidenced in the plan for jobs, but perhaps we've set out some slightly more radical or larger scale proposals than the government did. So we would like to increase employers' capacity to hire young people, to underpin the functioning of the labour market, and to support young people. And if you're interested in getting into some of the ideas that we've got about how you could go around doing that, then I'm happy to talk about that in questions later on. So I think what's going to happen next? Well, my sense is that this is not the end of the government stimulus packages. Rishi Sunak has said he's going to give a budget sometime in the autumn. I would expect that there is likely to be some new initiatives around employment in that budget. There may be some opportunities for announcements before that, particularly in areas which are set out in the plan for jobs that they could perhaps just tweak as they issue guidance. So an example of that would be the Kickstarter scheme, where there is not really enough information at the moment to actually operationalize it. And it may be that by operationalizing, but as they come out with that operational detail, they're able to tweak some of the details a little bit to make it a bit more appealing to employers. But that really remains up for debate. So the next really big opportunity for changes and new schemes is likely to happen in the autumn. By then, we'll have a much better idea of whether there's going to be a second spike or a second wave of the pandemic. We will also be able to start to see, it might take a little bit longer, but we'll be able to start to see whether some of the initiatives that were announced in the plan for jobs are actually starting to take hold in the economy, or whether actually the government needs to sort of turn up the power of them a little bit more. So my contact details as usual, but just to summarize really, I think we can say the economy is in recession. Recovery so far has been pretty slow, and the labour market is quite sluggish. The plan for jobs is currently at the heart of the government's reconstruction plan, and there are some very positive things in it, but so far it doesn't seem to be having the impact that they were hoping for. I think there are four main issues that student recruiters need to attend to and think about: the job retention bonus, the Kickstart scheme, whether you're going to increase or start traineeships, and whether you're going to increase or start apprenticeships. But as I say, this is probably not likely to be the end of the government's employment stimulus. So I will stop there. I'm very happy to answer some questions if people have got any questions. Yeah, over to you, Marina, for any questions.
Thank you, Tristram. Yeah, so if you missed the start of the webinar, you should find the question box in the software panel on your right-hand side. So yes, if you have any questions, please type them away and I will feed them through to Tristram. Also, as mentioned, the webinar is being recorded and you will get a link to the recording today or tomorrow, the latest. So far, we have one question from Stephanie. She's asking, do you have any insight as to when we're likely to receive updates on the Kickstart scheme?
Yeah, I think it's going to be pretty imminent. So I would expect some updates happening over August. Yeah, I mean, obviously these things will take time. There's quite a lot of detail to answer about exactly what constitutes employment of a young person, exactly what has to sit around it, criteria and so on. But I mean, I think the broad approach that's set out in the Kickstarter is probably fairly clear. But yeah, I think we'll probably get more details over August. But you know, it could bleed into September. These things often do get delayed. But yeah, I think we're hopeful for August.
I think that might be all our questions, but I suppose I'll give everyone a minute or two to type away any questions. But yeah, just a reminder, during this pandemic, we made a lot of our content available to everyone. So you can find all our previous webinars on our YouTube channel. So feel free to share this or any of our previous webinars with your colleagues and peers.
And just to say that we are keeping a very close eye on policy. I mean, in a normal period, government policy doesn't tend to make that much difference, particularly to graduate recruitment. It usually makes a bit more difference to apprenticeships and school leaver schemes. But at the moment, I think there's a very big chance that there will be new initiatives and things. And so we will be making sure that we keep people up to date with them as they come out. If there's no more questions, then I'm very happy to leave it there. And thank you for listening, everyone.
Actually, we did have a couple more questions. So the next question is from Andrew. He's saying there doesn't seem to be a lot in there for HE students / graduates. Is most of this aimed at entry-level jobs and apprenticeships?
Yeah, so it's very it's not very strong for graduates. You're right. I mean, a lot of the schemes don't formally exclude graduates. But what they do is make an under 24 requirement for most of the things that relate to young people. So it is possible that you could graduate, be unemployed for 6 months, and then apply to go on a Kickstarter scheme. So that it is open to graduates, or will be open to graduates. The same is true with apprenticeships. I'm not sure about traineeships actually. But yeah, so but no, they're clearly not the target audience. And you know, while I'm quite worried about the graduate market in general, and I think there will be an increase in graduate unemployment, I don't think that it's going to be as difficult for graduates as it is for non-graduates. So I think that probably is why the government has gone in the direction it has. But I mean, we were part of signing up with UUK for a series of sort of pledges that we asked the government to make in support of graduates, and I think it may be that there is more that they will need to do in that area in the future.
Stefan is asking if you have more info on a sector-by-sector breakdown, specifically arts, design, and media.
In terms of, I mean, what we know is that the issues with the labour market are very sectorally based. They're not general issues. I mean, it will ultimately it may affect other aspects of the economy, but at the moment it's very sectorally based. So it's in service-based industries. The arts and so on have been very, very badly hit. Currently, the government has not done very much. There was a rescue package which it announced for the arts sector a little while ago. I can't remember the exact amounts that were there, but I think it's one of the things that certainly many people who've been critical of the plan for jobs have been calling for, is to recognise the sectoral nature of many of the problems in the labour market and to do more. For example, it would be possible to extend the furlough scheme in certain sectors. Now, there are various problems with that, defining exactly who's in the sector and who isn't and so on. But, you know, for example, it may be that it's a long while before theatres can really open. If that's the case, should theatres be allowed to continue to furlough past October when everyone else is supposed to be going back to work? So these are issues that people are raising a lot. But yeah, we certainly can say the data will tell us that the level of concern about jobs and employment and the levels of recruitment are definitely varying very strongly by sector.
Thank you. Stephanie is asking, do you think there will be any changes to the levy?
It's something that we called for in our submission. I think at the moment I haven't heard anything. I think that there's quite a strong case for using pre-existing mechanisms to try and improve things. So, for example, allowing companies to use the levy more widely would be one of the sorts of things that we were arguing for, or channeling new money effectively through levy pots. That's at the moment, there's no plans from government to do that. I haven't heard any government sources saying that, so I think we'd have to say at the moment no, but it's certainly, the ISE is not alone in discussing the role of the levy in this situation.
Great, thank you. I see Sarah is asking, when do you think employers will know what their plans are?
So when will employers know what their plans are?
Yes.
I think it will be it'll emerge probably fairly gradually. From talking to employers, most people are starting their campaigns. So recruitment wise, most employers are starting their campaigns as normal in the autumn. But I think, and they've made quite substantial adjustments. We've talked about this quite a lot in lots of the other webinars we've done, putting things online, virtual careers fairs, these kinds of things. But I think in many ways, people will start the season as they would have done, but just with the switch online. As more economic data emerges through the autumn, as the situation with the pandemic becomes clearer through the autumn, I think employers have got quite a lot of capacity still to adjust their targets up and down quite a bit. So my guess is that employers will still be, they will start the year with a target. The indications that we've got so far is that it will be lower, but not radically so than previous year's targets. So maybe a 10, 20% down overall across the sector. But then as we move into the actual recruitment season, it is possible for employers to adjust up or down as the economy moves. So we'll certainly be reporting back, and I suspect the situation will emerge. And by the time we get to, say, February, we'll probably have a much clearer idea about how next year is going.
A couple of people actually ask, what is the difference between a traineeship and an apprenticeship? Yeah,
so a traineeship is kind of like an apprenticeship, but it's essentially a lower level and less demanding version. It's one of the things that's normally wrapped up in a traineeship is requirement for students to take English and maths as part of it if they've failed English and maths beforehand. But it can be shorter. It doesn't always. It's not always a paid position. So it's another form of work-based training, but it's a much kind of lighter, less regulated form than apprenticeships, and usually kind of lower skill, lower level form.
Thank you. Lucy's asking, are there any employers you're aware or of who have announced plans to really utilize any of these schemes?
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking to a number of employers. I don't think they've made sort of formal announcements. I won't name them yet, but I think we've been talking to at least a couple of firms who are looking at these things very seriously, who are very interested in things like the Kickstarter scheme and so on. So yeah, it's not at all that I'm saying these things are going to fall flat. I think they will have some take up. Whether that take up will be sufficient to make a big enough difference in the economy, I think is questionable, and whether also it will only be something that some larger firms undertake rather than sort of smaller firms. I think that's another question that we'll have to look into. But certainly some of the indication at the moment seems to be that SMEs have got a lot less bandwidth for thinking about these kinds of things.
Thank you. And I think this might be our last question. If traineeships haven't been successful and 1,000 to get a student on traineeship isn't enough for employers, what do you think would be enough?
Well, in terms of money, I suppose
yeah.
the thing, yeah, in terms of like with all of these incentives, I mean, my initial reaction, and I think the Kickstarter is different in this sense because the Kickstarter is it's paying a substantial chunk of the salary. Well, in fact, the whole of the salary if you only employ someone for 25 hours a week. But if we look at the others, you've got to think if you're a firm and you're going to bring someone back, even a relatively low-skilled, low-paid individual, how much difference to your decision-making is £1,000 or £2,000 going to make? And my sense is not an awful lot. That might pay a month's salary of somebody, probably not. Well, potentially less for some staff and so on. So when we're thinking about this, I think we've got to think, you're asking employers to, if you're trying to change the number of people they're employing, you're actually trying to ask them to change their calculations about risk. And so what we've suggested in our plan for reconstruction of the student labour market with the apprenticeships is that actually the government paid the 20% off the job costs. So they would pay 20% of the employment costs for a new apprentice to encourage employers to take them up. And why that's a relevant and hopefully a more meaningful amount than perhaps £1,000 or £2,000 would be, is that what you would be saying is that if you take this person on, all the time that you have them, when you're paying them to work rather than to train. So the government would be bearing the costs of the training. We're not saying that's a final and the only way to achieve it, but it would be a more substantial kind of offer to firms than the kind of offer that we're talking about that's in the plan for jobs. So that I think it's got to be something that is sufficiently large to change employers' calculation about the risk of taking on a new member of staff in the current very unstable situation.
Thank you, Tristram, and thank you everyone for your questions. I think we're going to wrap up, so look out for a link to the recording, and yes, have a look at our website. We have an extensive library of webinars, podcasts, blogs. So yes, there's a lot of content for everyone on the website, and hope to see you soon at one of our next webinars. Again, thank you everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.